that led to playing part-time, then full-time, and then following a 6-month motorcycle journey around Europe with my best friend. I came back to New York to rejoin university, and that's when my older brother Skip suggested I go give a listen to John Sebastian and Zalyanovsky, who were looking for a bass player. And I really still didn't take it very seriously, but I went on a lark. I was in New York City for the holiday of Christmas time, 1964, and I went and met with the two of them at this little music club in Greenwich Village, and we just clicked. It was like there was just no doubt in my mind from that very first day that not only were we going to make a band, but we were going to make a successful band.
And do you remember at that point having an initial plan of the sound that you wanted to achieve with the band?
Well, John, that was one of the keys, because I was at that point in my life, I was very goal-oriented, and I wouldn't have quit school on just the whim of joining a band, because I had plenty of those choices that I could continue on and still be in school. But John and Zolly not only had a plan, they also had on board a manager, Bob Cavallo, and a record producer, Eric Jacobson, and they pretty much pitched me with the idea that 6 months, give us 6 months, and we hopefully should have a band with a hit record on the charts, and you won't have to make second guesses on your taking a semester off. You'll stay with the band. And it was that plan that convinced me that one more semester wasn't going to hurt. And it was pretty almost amazing that 6 months, practically to the day, after that very first meeting, we were releasing our first single, Do You Believe in Magic, and preparing for our first tour out in California. So, yeah, there was a very serious, I don't know how serious it was, but it sounded serious to me, so I thought there was a plan.
Do you remember that magic moment when you first heard yourselves on radio?
Yes, I do. It was in San Francisco, and we were traveling from, I believe, our hotel. It may have been the airport, but we had just arrived, and we were traveling to the local rock station, the whole band in one car, and had the radio on, and in that short 20-minute, half-an-hour drive, the song came on the radio, unbeknownst to us, of course, that it would, but yeah, it did, and of course, we all looked at each other, and it was, basically some high fives, although they didn't high five in those days, but yeah, no, we did hear it on that very first trip, and it was what a feeling. It was one of those things like you can't compare it to any other, feeling. It was just great, and we were all together to share it, so it was even better.
Looking back, can you pinpoint a particular moment in time when you felt the band had really made it?
Well, had really made it, I would think, to me, would have been after Summer in the City went to number one.
Uh-huh.
That would be for me. Now, having said that, that's more a recitation of qualifications. What do you need to really make it in the 1960s? And the number one record would have to be amongst them. Although in my gut, I tell you when I thought we had really made it, as we taxied down the runway at JFK Airport in New York on the way to California, before we'd ever heard our song on the radio, Zolly and I were sitting together in the airplane as it taxied down the runway, and it was one of the first airplanes to have in-air entertainment with a little headset and audio playing. And as we taxied down the runway, we were all excited, and the song that came on first when we both put our headsets on was the Beach Boys' The California Girl. And I was just talking to John the other day about this, and he recalled it the same way I do, because he was also listening. That moment was like we knew we had made it. We were on our way to California to promote our first hit record, which we all believed was a hit.
Mm-hmm.
And on the radio, on the airplane, taxiing down the airport was one of our favorite bands, and playing their big California Girls hit. And that moment to me was when I knew the Lovin Spoonful had legs and wings and all the other things that go with making it.
Now, of course, you were a co-writer of Summer in the City. What do you recall of the construction of that song, how it all came together?
Well, yeah, that was an interesting song because it was one of the songs that when we came out of the studio, every single person spoke in unison that this is a hit, and it was put together in a fashion that was not like any of the other ones, and is that it evolved from a set of lyrics without a melody to a set of lyrics with a loosely structured melody, and then my contribution was a middle section that tied the whole entire song together, that made it become a 3-minute, pop music hit. And it was one of those kind of songs, and on a theoretical level, when you try to decide what makes one song a hit and another one that you like just as much not a hit, there's an element I call the racer's edge, which comes from sports where the margin of victory might be 1,000th of a second or less, and it's the unknown element in music making, and what it is that made Summer in the City such a massive hit when other songs of ours I thought were just as good, but never made that number one position. And so, in asking me about the construction, I tend to think it was that unique trio of circumstances and ideas that came together. John and I have co-written other songs that we more or less did as an exercise in songwriting, but this Summer in the City came together almost cosmically. I hate to use that expression, but it's kind of how I look at it, though.
The atmospheric sound effects that were used in the production, they also made that track something special. Do you recall how they came to be?
Well, the sound effects of the city, you mean, the cityscape?
Yeah.
Well, that was also beyond words, because in the pre-digital age, anything that was recorded was analog and had to be imported basically on a sound level basis, meaning that you had to find those sounds, bring them into the studio in a medium that could be transferred to the audio tape that you were recording the song on. And the only way to do it in those days was to have a technician, a sound effects technician come in, like they use in Hollywood movies or any movies and have for years. And so that's what we did. We hired a sound effects technician who put his tapes in of city sounds, and then literally sat in the middle of the studio on the floor with a tape recorder playing and a microphone, and we would go, that's the one, that's the horn sound, or that's the city sound right there, and just by playing different samples, which nowadays is how all records are made, but they're done with digital sampling. That's how those sound effects were added. And you got to remember, too, this is in the early days of multi-track recording, so there weren't a lot of, you couldn't do like about 25 different takes and then listen to them all to decide which one you needed. You had to kind of decide on the fly. So it was a pretty, Eric Jacobson did a great job on Summer in the City. He really did.
Aside from the obvious hits, are there any other tracks which you feel have really stood the test of time, more so than others?
Yes, most definitely, but my tastes are narrow, or no, they're not, but in this particular case, the songs that I like the most, other than the obvious hits, which, you like for a variety of reasons, but the tracks that I like the most were the more country rock, country folk kind of songs, like I'm Just Sitting Here Loving You, Darling Companion, a song that I wrote called Butchie's Tune.
Yep.
I think that they've stood the test of time, although outside of the mainstream. When we do our concerts nowadays, the audience, loves the hits, and we're fortunate enough to have so many that they constitute the majority of the show, but in the autograph lines and in receptions or meeting folks before and after the show, a lot of times their request will be for those, what I kind of call the chestnuts, the jug bandy kind of songs that sort of were the Lovin Spoonful's roots.
Were you happy with the Good Time Music label that was placed upon the band?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good Time Music, and it came to an end real quick in 1968, and not just within the Lovin Spoonful. The clouds over Vietnam were darkening. The political climate in America was terrible. And prior to that, we'd been through, in my age group, I'm 63, the extremely uplifting presidency of John F. Kennedy, and then the very depressing assassination. So Good Time Music to us was sort of like, yes, this is, it's more important to uplift the spirits than to make political statements. We made an effort to avoid political statements. And that was why Good Time Music to me, and I'm not speaking for the rest of the band, but for myself, was a real important label. And I still refer to it as Good Time Music.
And the band broke through around the same time as the British invasion. Did you see yourselves as rivals to those bands from England?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you asked that question in that way, because the British invasion essentially shut down the pop American music scene, with the exception of a few like the Beach Boys. And trying to get a record deal in 1965 or 1964, if you did not have a British accent, it was virtually impossible, if not actually impossible, to even get a record company to listen to you. So when the Lovin Spoonful and the Byrds and the Beau Brummels had their breakthroughs, it was, to me, I thought, really important. I don't necessarily thought we had stemmed the tide, because it was a very friendly competition. We all loved the bands from across the ocean, but it was an interesting time, because quite literally, with the exception of Motown, the American music scene was virtually occupied by the Dave Clark Five, the Beatles, the Freddie and the Dreamers, all the early 60s, mid 1960s English bands. So I think that there was a shift of the tide in 1965, and finally American bands could get back on the charts again.
Now, you managed to get your music involved in some early motion picture efforts for Francis Ford Coppola and Woody Allen. How did those situations come about?
Well, Woody Allen and our management team and Woody Allen's management team shared an office early in our career. In fact, Woody even opened for the Lovin Spoonful very early in his career as a comedian. Yeah. And I think it was at Fordham University. I'm not sure about that, so that better not be a quote, because I'm sure everybody will correct me. But he did open for us, and we did have a management office shared, and that's how that connection came about. Woody was a fan of the Lovin Spoonfuls, and essentially that record that we made, that was the soundtrack to What's Up Tiger Willie, was one of my most fun experiences in the 1960s, musically speaking, because Woody virtually gave us carte blanche to merely watch the rushes and come up with whatever we wanted to come up with in the way of a soundtrack. It was sort of the musician's dream. On the other hand, and it was also a very clever movie for its time. It was, perhaps the humor was a bit dry, but for the most part, everybody I've ever talked to since then just loves What's Up Tiger Willie. On the other hand, the Francis Coppola movie, our role was much more scripted, and the connection escapes me at this point. I'm not really sure why, other than the fact that probably the Woody Allen connection led to it was Francis Coppola's very first mainstream movie with a budget, and our role was scripted. John's songwriting was paramount. His "Well, You're a Big Boy Now" and and some of the other songs from the You're a Big Boy Now soundtrack were great songs, but virtually the rest of the band were players on the dates, but largely with charts and not much to do in the way of creativity.
Now, I believe you were the first or one of the first bands to record to 16-track, is that right?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, what Ampex told us is we were the first band, not first recording, but the first rock band to use the Ampex MM1000 16-track recorder. And we did sign the 16-track reel, the first one, and it was the album that I think I can speak for everybody in the band. If we could go back in the studio and change one thing, it would be a chance to remix that album. Because of the fact it was 16-track. The initial technology was, well, let's have a monitor for every channel. And you just imagine trying to listen to 16 speakers. So it was a bit of a nightmare. A couple of the producers literally dropped out of the project because of the stress of it. And I believe that if it weren't for Jerry Yester, everything playing would not have been completed. It never would have gotten done. It just, everybody had lost. We had all, for a variety of reasons, the Spoonful was at that point starting to come unraveled. And I still think of it as a great album that really never got a chance to spread its wings and fly because the technology was so new, and nobody really knew or gave us enough time to really get it right.
Now, the history books have it that the infamous drug bust of 1967 was a large contributor to the band eventually falling apart. How much of that is fact or fiction?
Well, the basic truth, the basic facts are the facts. There's no fiction there. The band, Josali and I were busted. It was a simple possession charge. It never should have been brought. The details of it, the minutiae of the details are incredibly tacky. It was, and I'm sure Zolly's departed, but Zolly and I were very close and knew this, that it was just tacky beyond belief what happened because it never should have happened. And did it contribute to the demise of the Lovin Spoonful? Well, I'd have to say yes. Zolly and I were both demoralized by it. There wasn't really, because of his immigration status, there really wasn't anything that could have been done differently and preserved the band at the time. So, we tried to put a brave face on it and say it had nothing to do with the bands separating, but I don't think you can look back with the 20/20 hindsight that you have when you look back and say anything other than the fact that it at least contributed to it. In 1968 there was, as I said earlier in this interview, there was a very definite darkening of the clouds in the culture of what we called the hippie generation. And I think our music was becoming less popular. I don't like to use that expression, but I can't think of a better word for it. And so whether the bust had happened or not, I think the Spoonful and Good Time Music would have become less relevant, and probably our 3-year run was what we were supposed to have in terms of our impact on pop culture. And I've come to grips with it, and if I could, like I say, go back in time and change something, that would be one of the things I would love to change. In hindsight, I wish we had had better advice.
Yeah.
We were 20-year-old kids, and there was nobody telling us that there was an alternative. So, yeah, it definitely contributed to the demise of the band. Sadly so, because, Zolly, we used to call ourselves the Death Duo. We were just inseparable, at least on the road, and it was just very sad. It was a very sad thing. It shouldn't have happened, and it was insignificant in its importance to A, the legal system, or B, culture. If the truth be known, the real truth be known, the truth that nobody has spun or put a coloration on, is that it was such a minor event, it never even should have made the booking station. They should have just gone, this is something. And, you know, in hindsight, John, I don't really want to go too far into this, but I'm going to blurt it out anyway.
Yeah.
Somebody has suggested more than once recently that the whole thing was a setup. And I wouldn't want to speculate because I have no idea, but it's been brought up, and so you never know. You know, you look back and you go, well, if this had been different and that had been different, and it was just one of those things. You can't change it.
Were there any thoughts of not continuing on with the band after John Sebastian left?
Excuse me a minute. Well, yes. We had a contractual obligation to the record company. We re-signed a deal in 1967 that required a delivery of a certain number of albums. When John left, and when Zolly left, and Jerry came into the band, we had everything playing, and we had high hopes. Zolly and Jerry were working together, so there wasn't any acrimony in the split, and we loved the songs on everything playing. We had high hopes for the release of the album and another top 10 hit, and onwards and upwards with a tour to support it. Unfortunately, I think that the part of the spin-off from the bust was that the brand newly emerging rock press, Rolling Stone, and the others that were just beginning to spread their wings, took it upon, especially Rolling Stone, took it upon itself to pretty much give us the scarlet letter. And as a result, the release of the singles came into an atmosphere of 1968, lightweight pop music and the drug bust. And as a result, none of the releases did well. And when the singles aren't doing well, your tour's not going to do well. And I think everybody just kind of went, let's do something different. Mm-hmm. And John took it upon himself to leave the band first. And Jerry, Joe, and I talked about, soldiering on. But basically, at that point, I had become obsessed with getting a sailboat and heading off to the Caribbean. And so I think that the answer to your question that I kind of approached on a long-winded fashion is that I think everybody was entertaining thoughts of it, but we had high hopes for everything playing, and we put it out there, and it just didn't work out.
Tell us about the recording studio you set up in the 70s, Blue Sea Studios.
Oh, that was a great experience, man. I loved that. When I did go and buy my sailboat in 1969 or 1970, I moved down to the Virgin Islands where it was home ported and spent about 4 years there. And in the process of meeting people, knowing people there, I came across somebody who wanted to build a recording studio. First, they were a salvager. They worked out of St. Thomas, and they salvaged shipwrecks. And they had the salvage rights to a big freighter, and its name was the Blue Seas. And he wanted to relocate a recording studio onto it, which I nixed the idea, or at least my participation in it, because I knew an old steel ship would just not be a good recording environment in terms of sound. Mm-hmm. So I didn't think much about it, but when I left the islands in 1974 and moved back to the States, I had met a rock band in St. Thomas, and the lead singer in it, the girl singer, and I had become boyfriend and girlfriend, and I visited her in Baltimore, and almost immediately they were going into the studio to record this demo they were making, and they invited me out to the session, and it was in suburban Maryland, suburban Baltimore, and it was just this incredible state-of-the-art studio. I had never seen anything like it in my career, and it turns out, you may know this, but one of the top audio engineers of all time, George Massenburg, who was the inventor of parametric equalization and basically digital recording as well, had built this studio, and he was the engineer at this technology company called ITI that also had developed the very world's first color cam or shoulder-mounted color video camera. And so during this session, the head engineer came up to me and said, look, the company that owns the studio is dissolving. The owner's moving to Hawaii, and he's trying to have these assets be managed. Are you interested in acquiring a recording studio? Because he knew I was in the Lovin Spoonful, and so I said, well, I don't really have any way to make you a financial offer, but let me make some phone calls and see what I can do. And so I called Bob Cavallo, the Lovin Spoonful's manager. And remember, now I've been out of the country for 4 years, and my only connection to pop music was every Saturday the Soul Train would come on, the local Puerto Rican television station, and everything else that I heard was Caribbean salsa and Latin music. So I had no idea what was going on in pop music in America. And when I called Bob Cavallo, he said, have you ever heard of Lowell George and Little Feat? And I said, no. And he said, well, you should. And because I told him I had this recording studio in Maryland, he says, there's something about that that's ringing a bell. Let me talk to Lowell George and I'll get back to you. And he called me back in about a couple of days and said, can you contact George Massenburg? I said, well, what I know or what I understand is that he's moved to Paris and he's sort of become an expat and is not coming back to America. He said, well, if you can contact him and get him to come back and engineer Lowell George's next album, I will give you enough of an advance to complete your deal for the studio. So, to make a real long story a little shorter, I went back to the studio owners and said, I will lease your studio in the existing facility and for these terms. And we came to an agreement. Recorded Feats Don't Fail Me Now out there in the industrial park, and then the studio itself, the overall holding company, went into receivership, and we got evicted we were served with an eviction from the building the studio was located in. I still had a valid contract for the lease of the equipment, but they could, and they also, it was very funny, I got to tell you this, because I don't know if you're familiar with a spice company called McCormick Spice.
Yes, yep.
But in this country, in America, it's one of the biggest, and they're the owner of the industrial park where this studio was located. And I got a call. I was home one day, and I got a call from my manager, and he said, you better get out here. We're being evicted. And I drove straight to the studio, and I walked into the control room of the main studio, and there was a crowd of people, including 2 deputy sheriffs, and I was introduced to Mr. McCormick, Sr., who was Old Man McCormick of McCormick Spice, and his vice president in charge of operations for his industrial park. And they told me why we were being evicted, that they didn't want long-haired types hanging around their industrial park, and that they would prefer it if we just go along peacefully, but if we didn't, that they were going to have the sheriffs evict us in 30 days. And then I proceeded to kind of read him the riot act, essentially saying to the owner of McCormick Company and his chief lieutenant that they would rue the day they threw rock and roll out of Baltimore County. And I'm telling you this story because the postscript is great. We all left that day in basic agreement that we had to leave, and there was going to be an auction, and the auction was going to sell off the entire contents of the studio, which was this great state-of-the-art, parametric equalized studio. And when the auction date came, I had dispatched my partner to New York to bring an investor down to bid on the various studios, that we would buy stuff and relocate it to some other location. Well, when the auction began, the auctioneer said, we're going to have 2 auctions today. The first one is going to be, we're going to take bids on the entire 3-studio complex. And by doing that, we're going to take those bids and then compare them to the second auction, which will be a piece-by-piece auction of every single piece in the 3 studios. And whichever one comes up more in the end is the way we're going to go. So that was the ground rules of the auction that was coming up for all the studio and all its gear and everything. And in the meantime, my friend who had been dispatched to New York to get our investor was stuck in a snowbank in New Jersey. The train was not, he was taking the train to Baltimore with the investor to come to the auction, and he couldn't make it in time. So they began the auction, and they asked for bids on the entire studio complex. And one person said like $15,000, a totally ridiculous figure. And another person may have said, well, $16,000. And the auctioneer went, are there any more bids? And it's going once, and I said, well, $18,000. I just threw the number out. I didn't even have 30 cents in my pocket. I threw out the $18,000, and they said, we have $18,000 going once, twice, third. And they proceeded to start the part-by-part auction, and the vice president of Maryland National Bank called the auctioneer over, and I had met this vice president. I knew who he was. He was the main honcho. And he called the auctioneer over, and he whispered in his ear, and the auctioneer stood up and took his gavel and banged it on the thing and said, the auction is over. The studio goes to Mr. Boone for $18,000. And you could have heard the collective gasp, because people had come from every corner of America to buy some of the stuff in this studio. And there was like people who were ticked off and outraged, and how can this be? We traveled here from California to buy that echo chamber, blah, blah, blah. So the auctioneer said, well, do you have 10% down? I said, I'll have it in an hour. And the guy said, okay, we're supposed to be here till 5 o'clock anyway. And so on the floor of the auction, I sold off an 8-track recorder to somebody from Jamaica. I sold off 2 of the echo chamber, the EMT echo plates, which are big, huge things, not really contemporary, but great sounding. And with those 3 items, I sold enough to pay off entirely the $18,000 and put some money in my pocket. And at the end of the day, we had gotten 3 studios entirely, 2 small demo studios and big Studio A, the board, 24 Neumann microphones that today would be worth a small fortune just by themselves, the great console, George Massenberg's custom console, a cutting room with a Neumann lathe and Neumann facilities for cutting direct to disc. And it was almost like, why did this happen? Nobody could fathom what happened. And the only thing I can think to this day what happened is that old man McCormick apparently might have had seller's remorse, or just felt bad about throwing us out of there, and told Maryland National Bank to, like, if we could possibly work it out and we don't lose faith, give Boone and his company some slack. Because we bought, what had to be, even at auction rates, of $100,000 worth of stuff in 1974 money, 74 it was. And then we took it and relocated it. I mean, hold on a second, I got to take a sip of water.
Sure.
We looked around for a location, and at the time, Baltimore was an old industrial city whose inner city had become completely abandoned by the middle class and the business. Everybody had moved out to the suburbs after the riots of 1968. And Baltimore had a very, very tacky reputation of American cities. And so I was there because I was meeting my girlfriend, and we got in this studio. Where are we going to put it now? And somebody suggested that the inner harbor of Baltimore had good opportunities, financially speaking, for locations. And we found this. We drove down there, and it really was very gritty. I mean, it was so gritty that even they had biker bars, and the bikers hardly ever showed up. But the inner harbor itself was quite quaint and attractive looking, and the owner of Armour Meat Company, John Armour, he was the heir to the Armour Meat Company fortune, had built a custom-built 135-foot houseboat for his second wife, and it was located in the inner harbor of Baltimore. It was beautiful. It was in a Danish modern style of architecture, and it just was gorgeously done. and his second wife had taken one foot on it and it moved underneath her feet. She said, I don't want to go on this, I'm done. So he wanted to get rid of it, and he was looking to lease it out. And our investor, the guy who came down from New York and eventually got there, had connections in Baltimore's business class, and heard about this barge that was for rent, and passed the word along to us that it was available for lease. And so we negotiated a lease with John Armour and leased this 135-foot barge out, and with Massenberg's help, relocated all of the equipment onto the barge itself, and set up shop, and did about 2 more years of recording. Had some success, and we recorded a lot of great artists. Emmylou Harris was there, and Verdine White from Earth, Wind and Fire came in and recorded some bands he was working with, and Reggie Knight, and just a lot of people came through, especially from the bluegrass community. Emmylou, and a great, fabulous band from the Washington D.C. area called the Seldom Scene. Ricky Skaggs was there. So we had a great deal of success. But then in the winter of 1977, the studio on Christmas Day, everybody was out of town except the manager, and it sank. And to this day, nobody has ever really concluded exactly what happened, but the investigation ranged from, well, they did it for the insurance, well, we didn't have any, so that one quickly evaporated. And then the story was that somebody on a malicious intent had sunk the studio, which was possible because there was only one of the 2 main bilge pumps working at Christmas time, and it was easily overwhelmed. So we never knew what happened, and the downside of it is that the equipment could have been replaced, but the entire tape library of 2-inch audio tapes tipped over when the studio got off axis, and all those tapes fell in the salt water.
Oh no!
Of course, they were unsalvageable. So at that point, it became just obvious that Blue Season's days were over as a studio, and that drew that era to a close.
Now, Steve, I've just got a couple of minutes left to go. Before I let you go, tell us about the band today and the makeup of the Lovin Spoonful these days.
Well, today the band is Jerry Yester, myself, and Joe Butler of the original 1960 members. And then we have a drummer, Mike Arturi, who's a fabulous drummer from the Chicago area. He's 52, I think. And our guitar player is from Jerry's current residence in Harrison, Arkansas, Phil Smith, all a fine musician. And essentially the band is doing well, I suppose it's fair to say it's a tribute to the Lovin Spoonful. We don't do any new material, with the exception of one song, and we have maybe a 20 to 30 date a year concert schedule on average, and it's a good band. It's carrying on the tradition of the Lovin Spoonful. I had wished that John would join us. He just has no interest in being with the band. It doesn't have anything to do with our friendship, but I would, prefer if he was there, but
sure, yeah.
He's not. So
does it have his blessing though? He's quite happy for you to do it?
Yeah, I think that he would prefer it didn't happen if he were to be, totally candid. John and I are real close. There's not an estrangement between us in any way. I would bet he would probably prefer that the band was just left, the name had just been left in posterity. But he has no grudge against it at all. He's glad to see us working.
I'll have to confess, I did interview John once, and I asked him about it, and always his response was, "Well, it's legal."
Right. Well, that's about, I think that if he had his choice, he would say, why don't you do something else? But he can't stop it, and then for all practical purposes, why would he want to?
Yeah, that's right.
That would just become silly kind of tabloid headlines.
Sure. When the books are closed on the band, how would you like to see them remembered?
They brought some good time music into the mid-1960s. I think that really says it all. I'd like to have people think that the band was more than just a pop music band, because I find, unfortunately, a lot of people that weren't either at that age or into that music associate us with light pop music, and I think the transition between a jug band to a folk rock to the Lovin Spoonful was an essential part of the evolution of the American music scene.
Yeah.
So, I could go on how I'd like to see it remembered, but I think that our motto, good time music, is really how we still like to be considered, that we bring some good times into people's lives with our music, and the messages that are in those lyrics speak for themselves.
Fantastic. Steve, thanks so much for your time. It was great we finally got to catch up with each other today.
Well, John, once again, I feel so bad, and I have a terrible memory, but I had you not only on the calendar, I was walking around the house, and this wonderful landscaping job was just taking my breath away. So I hope that it really wasn't inconvenient for me to have you call back at this time.
No, it's actually worked out better for me, so all's well that ends well.
Good. Well, I know Lena really wants you to know that's... she was so mortified by it. I can't even begin to tell her. But
tell her not to worry. It's quite funny, actually, if you think about it.
It is quite funny. It's a vignette all in itself, and I'm glad that we worked this out and had this interview. It was some really good questions. I appreciate it.
Tremendous. Thanks again, Steve. Take care.
You're quite welcome, John. You take care, too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.